Hey everyone, welcome back to the Doctors In podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nadia Saba. Today's interview is part of our series of episodes where we are focusing on energy in controlled environment agriculture. My guest today is Sam Milton, principal of Climate Resources Group, or CRG. His company helps CEA operators and facility developers across the country reduce their energy use and the associated operating cost. One of his specialties is guiding his clients through the incentives application process, which can be quite daunting, and also helping to identify power reduction opportunities to avoid those high peak demand utility rates. Over the years, he's collected over $5 million in utility incentives for his clients. As some of you may know, I personally am more experienced with the regulation side of energy efficiency and am less involved with energy incentives and rebates. I'm super excited today to talk more about the carrot approach to energy efficiency and less about the stick approach when it comes to energy reduction measures. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me on the Doctors In podcast to talk carrots.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I appreciate the invitation to come here, and congratulations on your recent milestone of 100 episodes of The Doctor Is In. It's an
Thank
honor
you.
to be on this, and yeah, it's exciting all the work that you've done so far, getting this podcast put together, and all your other work, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Energy is such a hot topic in CEA because it is the second highest operating cost at these cultivation facilities. And so I really wanted to do this deep dive into energy. And so, we've talked about what is energy. Today's podcast with Rob Eddy from RAI drops, where we're talking about energy efficiency opportunities and best practices. And today we're talking about the carrot, and the next episode is going to be talking about the stick, just so you know. So we're going to start with the positive and then end on that note within this realm of energy efficiency. So I just wanted to start with a definition.
Yeah.
What are incentives and rebates? Who provides them? What is the goal? And is it really only about energy efficiency, or are there other types of incentives and rebates out there?
hmm Yeah, definitions are always a good place to start, right? This is perfect. So, yeah, I mean, incentives, of course, and rebates span a lot of different categories. So for the first part, incentives and rebates are kind of synonymous in those two terms. People kind of do use them interchangeably, and there are some differences. But for the most part, it's any sort of basically usually a cash payment or a tax credit that some sort of authority will give a customer to install some energy efficient equipment in their facilities. So you've got residential incentives and commercial, but for the most part, they do take the form of basically kind of it's an agreement that if the customer agrees to use less energy, then the incentive granting authority will pay them some money to do that. And so you've got the federal agency generally has been in the game for this. We'll see where that goes, right? Anybody knows what's happening at the federal level. If they know, please tell me. I would love to get the scoop on kind of where this is going. Some state agencies will provide some incentives, mostly in the form of grants. But where I mostly sit is in the utility world. And this is kind of where I see some of the most consistent activity with respect to incentive granting for businesses. So that's what I focus on. So I think this is there's always going to be a lot of stuff in the utility world, but of course the devil's in details, right? Where will there will be the most money, in the next few months. We have a sense, but we'll see where it goes. But yeah, it's free money to do good stuff.
Well, why? I mean, why are these utilities or state and local and federal governments interested in giving the building sector, whether it's in CEA or commercial or
Yeah.
residential, like why do they care about energy efficiency? I mean, I feel like that's, a stupid question, but, you know, what is their ultimate goal in providing these incentives and rebates to the people that might, install or implement energy efficient equipment and measures?
hmm No, it's not a stupid question at all. It's a question I get all the time. Like the mindset of most people out there is like, yeah, why would a utility pay me money to buy less energy? Right? It kind of doesn't make sense. But every authority that is delivering an incentive will have their own rationale, right? So on the, we start with federal, just because it's the highest level, but their motivation is, well, in the past, maybe since 2008 or so, since the Obama administration, had been to help businesses kind of reduce their environmental footprint and their carbon footprint. So they would give out a lot of money for solar energy and incentives and for any sort of renewable energy that would, reduce the carbon intensity of the grid and for that customer. So they did it in a large part, well, to reduce the carbon intensity for the country. But also, of course, there's always kind of the business motivation. So how can they help support, not to be too cynical about it, but, special interests they may have helped them get elected, right? But so their motivation may be twofold. At the state level, it can differ widely. So I'm based in the Northeast, New England, spent a lot of time in Massachusetts, now in Maine, here in California. So the states and the coasts kind of speak the same language. So they're very much aligned around, hey, it's important for the state because we're actually tracking our carbon emissions. And we have state goals to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. And one way we can do that is by incentivizing the building sector to use less power. Because of course, for the most part, grid-based power uses fossil fuels, and fossil fuels being kind of the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. If we're not talking about the cattle sector, but in terms of like the electricity consumption, it comes from the building sector, right? So let's help buildings use less power, and that helps our statewide greenhouse gas footprint, become smaller. So that's what's happening on the coasts and in some of the states. Illinois, has energy efficiency standards for that reason as well. Um, most of the states that have programs at a state level will, are guided by that. Um, there are states that do it just for the purpose of, wanting to support the grid reliability. So this is kind of, what you might find in Texas and in the southeast part of the United States. They're guided by the principle, which is I think also consistent across the rest of the country. But we need to have a better, basically, handle on kind of what the grid will be delivering. Or I should say what the demand is going to be for power on the grid, and how can we kind of moderate that as much as possible? Because the less demand there is for power, that means the grid doesn't have to operate as many power plants, and so there's an inherent interest on the part of grid planners to do that. Utilities are a different story, right? Because some of them they actually get revenue from building more power plants, right? This is the deal that the social contract that they've made is that they'll build power plants, and then ratepayers, who are basically electric customers or gas customers, they pay for the privilege of having power and gas come from that infrastructure. So they like building new stuff, which is great. At the same time, in many cases, they actually don't get any money for selling more power. So again, I think this is the states are different in this respect. So it's called decoupling. So in the East Coast and I think in the West and in other parts too, utilities, they don't get paid for selling more power. They only get paid for building more infrastructure and for managing the system. And so for those utilities, they actually get kind of bonus payments from the Public Utilities Commission to hit efficiency targets. So they're actually motivated to get as much money out the door, because if they do that, then they hit the targets that the PUC has set for them, which is pretty crazy. So there are lots of different games happening all at once. But the good news is that commercial and residential customers can play this game and can take advantage of these range of incentives that the operators have. So yeah, it's crazy, but it's real. These things are actually legit, and that's the thing I always tell people is like, Yeah, these programs are out there and they can help you reduce your costs. And by the way, you can also get a nice fat check in return for your project.
So I just wanted to follow up with that. So some states want to achieve, decarbonization goals or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and so they're motivated by reducing energy use in order to reduce the amount of combustion gases that are generated to when they're generating power that then gets delivered to their customers, right? So that's one. And then you said the other was grid, right? To reduce the strain on our electrical grids and make sure that we have enough power to supply future
Mhm.
demands. So I just want to sit on this for just 1 second. So in California, we have very aggressive decarbonization goals,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
you know, the state is working really hard with the utilities in order to build more renewable energy sources, right?
Mhm.
Solar and wind.
Yeah.
And my question on that, and even if you are a fan of nuclear, right? Low greenhouse gas
Yeah.
emissions. Um, I guess my question related to combustion gases,
Mm.
specifically in greenhouse gas emissions, is if, let's say in the state of California, 100% of the power is generated from renewables and nuclear, why would energy efficiency matter in the
Mhm.
decarbonization game?
Mhm.
Does that argument go away and now it's more about grid supply?
I think grid supply is the main argument, right? So I think it's just a function of what the available supply is of power, right? So if there's unlimited amount of power, if some genius from Caltech invents some sort of widget, nuclear, fusion technology that basically where energy is too cheap to meter, then yeah, then the energy efficiency argument goes away because yeah, it's like, hey, it doesn't matter because there's more power we can always get. But until that moment happens, we're going to be operating with a finite amount of electricity and gas out there to come, to power our buildings and homes. So as long as we're in that situation, then it's gonna make sense to kind of ration the amount of power that's available to the grid, and at least try to again provide some sort of incentive like a carrot or maybe a stick as you'll talk about later in your next episode. But they'll use kind of one or both of those tools to like just kind of give a signal to customers like, hey, it's great that you're using power for your facilities, for your business, but we're not going to let you use as much as you possibly can for whatever reason. Or if you want to, you'll have to pay for the privilege, right?
Right, right.
So
Which we do
that's kind of where
already
you
in a way. Yeah.
yeah, so that's where you get demand charges are coming in, right? So, which we can get into that, but basically, like if you're using power at a moment when the grid is at it's like just bursting at the seams, then you're going to pay a lot more for that power than if you were to use it in the middle of the night when there's like a lot of just kind of power sitting around.
Right, right. A lot of people think that it's a fool's errand for California or any other state to
Yeah.
try to be reliant 100% on renewable energies.
Mm,
But I am very proud that, last year there were 2 or 3 days in June of all months,
hmm.
because it's hot here in California, where the renewable energies completely met the demand
Yeah.
of power and electricity in the state of California. So it is possible,
Yeah.
and we've made one small incremental step, and so I'm really proud to be able to report that because people don't think it's possible, but
Hmm.
it is. So.
Yeah.
Um, and I just want to say one more thing because to me, as a mechanical engineer, heavily involved, with the societies for, HVAC and mechanical engineering, that there is this big elephant in the room, that, in my opinion, which is, data centers, Bitcoin mining centers, these these giant, computerized machines that are just sucking the life out of our grids and, are just, I should have been prepared for a statistic, but probably 1 second, right, one chat GPT
Right.
prompt is probably equivalent to, a
Yeah.
million homes or something. And so it's just,
Hmm.
sometimes I think where we are right now because of data centers and, generative AI and all these things, like, why are we even going after these drops in the bucket now? Shouldn't we be putting all of our focus on these data centers because that is ultimately what's going to kill the grid and any of our goals that we've been attempting to achieve over the last 25 or so years with carbon emission reduction?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, I think one of the reasons I got into the indoor ag and the cannabis space in particular, as an industry to focus my attention on, because I'm an energy efficiency professional, the idea was like, hey, these sectors are using by far and away kind of the largest percentage of power compared to other sectors. So I was like, hey, folks who are growing crops indoors, like we need crops. This is great. We need all sorts of produce that we can produce. But it's also very energy intensive. So in fact, as you probably know, growing cannabis indoors is, I think, like 20 times more energy intensive than like the second highest energy use for a building. I think it's basically as energy intensive or more so than aluminum smelting, which is a crazy energy intensive industrial activity. So yeah, I think it makes sense to focus on kind of the low hanging fruit, as you mentioned. Um, because yeah, I mean that's you it's like the 80-20 rule, right? You put forth 20% of your effort and get 80% of your returns. So let's do that for the energy sector as well, and for carbon emissions. It'll be interesting to see where this all goes, and if data centers can innovate as quickly as we need to, because I totally agree with you, Nadia. I mean, it's kind of scary how energy intensive these facilities can be. Um, and we need to do whatever we can. I mean, I think you've probably seen stories at least about how some of these data centers are basically are going underwater. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but it just made me a pilot project thing. But Microsoft, I believe, was going to be building a facility. Actually, I think I've seen pictures of it. Built a facility. Again, it's not like a massive, 10, acre building, but like a decent sized building. It is a test pilot project, but they put it underwater, as a way to help kind of mitigate against the cooling needs that you would need for a facility that might be on land somewhere. They actually need to mechanically cool it. So
Like
the
they
idea
put
is like the
the entire data center
yes,
underwater,
yes,
like
yeah,
on the ocean floor or
yeah, yeah.
lake bed or something.
Yeah, just floating off there with the coast of Seattle, I think, was kind of, where their
Oh, of
test base
course,
was.
yeah, out in one of
Um,
those fjords or the sound or something.
yeah, I'd love to follow up and kind of and see where that went. But there's a lot of innovation happening,
Yeah.
I think, to do this because yeah, people realize that it's a problem. So I think it's kind of regardless of the industry, I think wherever you're seeing the biggest need, that's where people's attention will go, and also kind of where there's innovation happening. That's if there's some brilliant idea that somebody has to reduce dramatically the energy intensity of an industrial activity, I certainly count data centers as being industrial, right? Um, they're not creating machines necessarily, but they're creating, zeros and ones for us to do our ChatGPT searches and our making our virtual cat videos. So it's an industrial process like anything else.
Yeah.
So we have to go somewhere. But I know, back on the topic of CEA and innovation, one of the things that we were wondering about was like, what happens, once we've done all the innovation that there is to innovate, right? I mean, if, so the LED revolution, right, I think is one of these things that has kind of dramatically reduced the energy intensity of kind of indoor cultivation and greenhouse cultivation, where it's used. And of course, we can argue, I'm sure, for hours and days as to kind of, the net benefit of LED versus HPS, and if you get different quality, different benefits to the crop. But in any event, there is, it's fairly demonstrated that energy savings, at the plug level are better if you're using a LED. So and the lighting piece, like what's next? I don't know what we'll see, but there's somebody's going to innovate some new lighting technology. I mean, I have to believe that we've gone from 1,000 watt high pressure sodium fixture to like a 720 watt LED. Who's to say there's not someone going to invent like a 300 watt blankety blank light, or even a 20 watt light, at some point. So there'll always be some innovations happening in the sectors. And again, where the need is the best, is the greatest. I think we'll see that go. But I mean, it's crazy how much new R&D is going into the horticultural lighting market. And I'm sure you've seen on the HVAC side too, right? People are just
Not
putting
enough.
not yeah, maybe
Yeah, not
there's
yeah,
always not enough.
not enough in HVAC, but yeah, I
Hmm.
mean
Hmm.
with LEDs, and I mean that's a good segue to start talking about
Yeah.
what incentives and rebates are available to controlled environment agriculture. But LED conversions, right, are one of the biggest areas,
Hmm.
and probably most tapped into
Yeah.
incentives and rebates. And maybe not, but that is my understanding just based off of all the activity
Yeah.
in the industry. But you're mentioning different innovations in lighting, and I am curious to see what could come next, because LEDs are only the efficiency and efficacy of LEDs is limited, right?
Yeah.
There is a ceiling. We
Hmm.
can only use so many red diodes, which is how we get to energy efficiency with LED lights, is using more and more red diodes. And at some point, plants don't just want to grow under red light. And so,
Hmm.
the efficacy and the yield, ultimately, if that's our metric,
Yeah.
is going to be tapped out.
Mhm.
So, right now we have LED technology to replace high pressure sodiums or ceramic metal halides, and I'm just curious from your perspective, how many growers you think are taking advantage just specifically of the rebates and incentives available to LE, for these LED conversions? Is this basically available to operators all over the country? Like, could and we're talking both cannabis, right?
Yeah.
There's that. And then there's lettuce and veggies. So I realize cannabis isn't legal in all states. And so just kind of a sense of, are growers taking advantage of the rebates that are available to them to do these LED light replacements?
Hmm. That's a really good question, and one that I think I have the answer to, but I'm constantly reminded that that there's more education to do. There's more awareness that needs to be spread about these programs. It seems like, I mean, again, as I'm in this stuff all day long, so I'm like, of course, people know about these piles of money, that are available to help them install LEDs and other energy efficient equipment. But and and utilities do have large marketing budgets too. Like there are people who are legitimate salespeople that utilities have hired to go out and get these deals done. There aren't enough, I don't think, of those people, because again, there are still lots. There's still a yawning gap between the opportunity that exists for these incentives to go out and the uptake, of them. In fact, this is kind of one reason why I got into this business about maybe 8 years ago now. I was working for an energy efficiency provider that did commercial, industrial, and residential projects across the country, and I was their Northeast policy director. So I would go to hearings and state houses and legislative meetings and utility hearings and whatnot, and it would just became obvious that there was so much more money that the utilities had budgeted for that they were actually able to give out. And it just blew my mind that like there were people who were, companies, that had the potential to collect millions of dollars in incentives for stuff that they wanted to do anyway, but just were not, for whatever reason, doing it. They didn't know the money was there, or they didn't have the wherewithal to track it down or to collect it. As you mentioned, right, there's definitely a process, and I kind of, I set out to like really understand kind of, what those gaps were in the decision making process and kind of why businesses, weren't adopting them. And I think for the most part, it's, just it's a, information gap. I mean, there was a lot of just, a lack of awareness that these programs really exist. And also there's kind of this myth that it's almost too good to be true, right? I think that's kind of the biggest misconception I've seen is that, people, at least earlier on, didn't think that there was any way that utility would give out any money to a customer to install energy efficient equipment. It just didn't seem possible. It made no sense whatsoever. I think we're seeing that change. There are now firms like mine, and even some who do even who spend a lot of time in the very kind of narrow world of lighting rebates. So I think most people again being companies that are building out a new facility at least have heard a story of somebody getting an incentive. So I think the information gap maybe is smaller than it used to be, but there's still a bandwidth gap. So it's people. It's like, again, if you're operating a business, and this is kind of what I've been learning over the years. If you're operating a business, like it's not your, despite kind of I think it probably should be, but your number one priority is not to install energy efficient equipment. Your number one priority is to just keep the business growing, stay in business, hit your payroll, produce your widget, whatever that is. And sure, if you can get an incentive to install equipment in your manufacturing facility, that's great. But lots and lots of times that kind of just gets thrown to the side because it's kind of an inconvenience to think about, frankly. And I think that's kind of where we are now, where people like know about it. And if the utility doesn't make it super easy to get the dollars, then people won't do it. So kind of part of my job is to make it easy for those cultivators to get the money, even for a complicated project. So I kind of for a complicated efficiency program. So my job is kind of provide that translation service and kind of facilitate the customer's ability to collect that money. Even if they don't have the bandwidth internally to do it.
Yeah. One of the barriers that we saw when we did our energy survey a
Hmm.
few years ago out here in California is that operators were concerned that equipment that is more energy efficient
Hmm.
wouldn't perform as well.
Right.
Right. So if you think about even just if we stuck with lighting, that, switching from high pressure sodium to LED lights, that they're concerned that they're not going to get the same yield or same quality. Right. And I think that over time, with enough experience from enough growers, that concern, you know, is not as significant as growers once thought.
Hmm.
As long as you learn how to pull the other levers with
Right.
climate and irrigation and everything to get the same response. But even in terms of HVAC equipment, it's like, kind of like you said with grower bandwidth, it's like, they're just trying to figure out how to do it.
Right.
Like once we figure out how to do it, then we can optimize, right? Then we can find the places where we can save energy, save water, reduce our resource utilization, right? And really optimize the equipment and the operations that we have. And I feel like, if you look at energy efficiency and the trajectory in commercial and residential buildings, really started in the 70s, and it took 40 years for them to get to LED lights. And, it only took a decade for regulators and utilities to say, here, growers, use LED lights. Now,
Hmm.
luckily, there are enough growers who are willing to be guinea pigs to say, to test it out and to prove that, yes, it worked. But it almost feels like, in other building sectors where there was a time to occupy and design and operate a building and learn what works and what doesn't work, and then apply energy efficiency measures, it really feels like CEA has been targeted, and I understand why, but is targeted to and pushed, right? Not just nudged, but pushed in a lot of
Yeah,
ways to do energy efficiency when they haven't even figured out how to grow a damn plant
for
and
sure.
building, right? Like
Hmm.
it's like we have to give, in my opinion, we have to give growers some time, right? And experience to learn how to grow these crops indoors in greenhouses with CEA technology before we ask them to optimize, because we haven't even agreed on what the metrics are,
Right.
right? Let alone
Hmm.
figuring out how to reduce one input and hope that you get the same output. If growers aren't even, measuring the inputs and the outputs to begin with, what does energy efficiency even look like?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
how do we even define energy efficiency in our industry? Like, do you know, like, what metric do you like to use? What metrics are you hearing growers use out in the field?
Yeah, no, it's a funny thing, and a quick story about that is that in Massachusetts, where like I was living at the time and was kind of involved in this work, during the creation of the regulated cannabis market out here, there was a discussion, right? Okay, how does the state think about the energy piece of the industry? And again, I think there was certainly a lot of expectation that it would be, of course, we all know that growing cannabis stores is a very energy intensive activity. And Massachusetts, being one of those states that had greenhouse gas reduction goals, got very much freaked out by this. And they're also, they're a little bit disorganized. But so at the 11th hour and 59 minutes, they put together this kind of energy compliance proposal. And
35 watts per square foot.
36
No,
watts. Yeah,
30.
36 watts.
I'm
But
sorry. You got
yeah,
to
yeah,
measure
yeah.
it
No,
up.
you're close. Yeah, not bad. And anyway, but it came based on the lighting power density standard of looking at efficiency, right? So
Yeah.
you're looking at a
Yeah.
commercial office building and say, all right,
Yep.
there's so many fixtures per, I don't know, in a given room, and there's a lighting power density standard. That's pretty common, I think, in a lot of commercial
Yeah.
sites.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of the go-to way of looking at efficiency, at least on the lighting piece. And they're like, okay, well, let's just assume a grow operation is kind of like an office building, right?
Yep.
And of course, we know that there couldn't be anything further from the truth. An office building, not the same thing as a grow room, but they use the same metrics to kind of to identify what an efficient model looks like in both of those. So that's kind of where we came up with that's where they came up with the 36 watt per square foot standard.
Yeah.
Which again, I mean, this is put together by regulators from the energy department in the state of Massachusetts, who had no experience growing the crop, right? They had no experience even, I think, studying the cannabis industry across states. And again, we're talking 2016. So I mean, at this point, kind of the eons ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah. 10 years
Um,
ago feels like forever.
yeah,
Yeah.
but so there was a smattering of examples out there. But yeah, they kind of like took the only tool that they knew
Yeah.
off the shelf and like slapped it on the this industry. And I think actually the jury is still out as to what the actual result of that was with respect to the state's energy kind of greenhouse gas
Mm.
footprint. Like, are Massachusetts growers, are they more efficient now? Or are they more efficient than those in Vermont or Maine or Colorado, where they don't have those same standards? I don't know. We'll see. I think there's a case to be made that the quality of the product here may not be up to par with the other states where people could grow with the high pressure sodium fixtures, and didn't, weren't restrained by that technology that the regulators demanded that they use. So that's kind of it's a funny kind of evolution in the way that kind of the at least the sticks were developed. So
Yeah.
I'm definitely I'm gonna tune into your next episode of this podcast and really kind of and kind of hear what the state conversation is, because that was a funny thing that we had a front row seat to.
Yeah, for sure.
And did our best to kind of mitigate it, but yeah, it was what they wanted to do.
And I understand, using the metrics that you're used to wrap your heads around what is coming, and what is potentially very disruptive to your carbon action plans or decarbonization goals.
Mhm.
I know, like the city of Boulder was
Yeah.
really on track to hit their carbon action plan goals. In like 2015, 2020, like they were right on track to
Hmm.
hit it. And then cannabis was legalized in the state of Colorado, and it completely obliterated all the work that they had done for 20 years to
Hmm.
achieve those targets. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely freaked a lot of people out. And I do hand it to California for taking the time to understand what lighting metrics are important to horticulture.
Hmm.
Being, the number of photons
Yeah.
produced per joule of energy, input to that lamp. And so it's not a watts per square foot sort of metric. It's a micromoles per joule sort of
Hmm.
metric, something that actually makes sense to plants and to growers. But, from the grower's perspective, other than, photosynthetic photon efficiency, micromoles per joule, what are their goals for energy efficiency? Is it primarily to save money? Have you come across any growers that are interested in, sustainability and reducing their carbon footprint?
Oh, Nadia, how much time do you have for this answer?
One
It's
minute. Yes,
Yeah,
no.
man. Well, I mean, so when I started my business, I called it Climate Resources Group because I thought it'd be, there would be a lot of demand for this service that I had kind of aspired to offer, which was, all right, what are the suite of activities that you can pursue to reduce the overall, carbon footprint of your business, right? Like, do you
Yeah.
want to be a climate friendly business or institution or a local government? How can you get there? And so the idea was that, I have these tools to help folks get there. But at the end of the day, for better or for worse, people are very excited about the idea of incentives and also compliance too. So there's compliance work that we also do to help people comply with those rules, as we just discussed in Massachusetts, around the lighting power density and kind of other energy and environmental standards. So we have the compliance work that we do, but really it's like, all right, just help me with getting this money from the utilities or from the states, and that's kind of what I want. So I think at least in the cannabis space, where I've been spending most of my time. Um, to have to say, there's maybe been one example of out of like, many dozens, where someone's been like, hey, I am interested in the carbon piece of my business. And I really want to find ways to become a carbon neutral business in the next, few years. And how can you help me with that? And so we did help them develop a plan and got there. But the kind of the I don't know, this would be expected really after all this. Like the only reason they were doing that is because the local zoning authority, the city that they were looking for a permit in, required this of them, which was funny because they hadn't really, as far as I could tell, the city did not ask any other business, in the community to come up with a carbon neutral plan. But they
Wow.
forced this applicant to do that, which was pretty wild. And so we did that, and yeah, I'm not quite sure, where they actually are with respect to their carbon emissions. I think they were kind of the plan at kind of the outset was to. Well, I won't get into it, but we'll see where they are. But yeah, that's the only case where there's been a kind of real enthusiasm for the carbon piece and for sustainability because they had to do it. I've been tracking the ESG and the environment sustainability and kind of in government's piece for a while now and been thinking about this. Like my kind of earlier training was in sustainable development. So I was like, hey, let's find ways to help these businesses, just operate more profitably, but also with the lower environmental footprint. And there have been a couple companies out there that are out there, at least again in the cannabis space, but not very many, right? I think in the CEA world more broadly, I think where you've got some larger capitalization and you've got larger companies that are actually trading on the market. I think you are seeing that. You're seeing some companies, kind of go after the B Corp certification, where they actually have standards they have to hit, around their governance and their social impact and their environmental footprint, which I think is really cool. And I applaud those companies for doing it. And we don't see enough of that. But at the end of the day, I think really people are just kind of looking for money to pursue projects that they think will help their business.
So,
It's yeah.
I mean, okay, so probably growers are more motivated by saving money
Hmm.
and is it right that they're saying, okay, I'm going to use LEDs, whether it's a new build or they're going to replace their old high pressure sodium lamps, because they believe that they're going to use less energy and they're going to reduce their energy bills?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a part of that. I think kind of I think frankly the energy billing piece is farther down the line. Maybe is out of 10 issues that they're following, it's maybe like 7 or 8. I mean, I think there's
Seven or eight
which is
out of
lower than you'd
10?
expect. Right, you're right.
So
It's
then
not
why
important.
would they even want to use LEDs in the first place? It
I
can't
think,
just
well,
be because they're gonna I mean, and I'm maybe
yeah,
break it down between a new build because that seems obvious. If you're gonna
right.
get paid, right, to buy LED lights rather than, buy high pressure sodium lights, that
Hmm.
seems like a no-brainer, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
someone's gonna foot the bill for buying lights. Okay, yes, I want to do that. Completely
Hmm.
understand that. But why would an existing operation replace high pressure sodium with LED lamps if it's not about operating savings?
Yeah, I think well, if they're happy with the performance of the high pressure sodium fixtures, then the only reason they would do it is if they're energy cost savings, right?
Okay.
That would be the only reason to do it. But yeah, I think for new construction folks, they want to do whatever is the most productive, for their crop type. So I think for the most part, that's kind of the priority. It's like, how can I just to grow this crop in the way that makes the most sense to my head grower? If they're really into high pressure sodium, then that's kind of what we'll do. If they're into LEDs, that's what we'll do. And the cost piece of it, the cost savings piece of it is nice too, but they want to get there with the lowest upfront cost, and that's kind of a big thing too, is the upfront cost. Not even the operating costs as much. Again, thinking for a new construction, for example. And again, thinking also in the cannabis context, but there was, there's a rush to the market and there's a lot of competition out there, and basically the first movers are the ones that are going to get the biggest chunk of the market. You want to get out there as quickly as you possibly can and with the lowest capital expense to get there. And that tended to be the kind of the cheaper high pressure sodium fixtures. And again, and that technology is what people knew. That was the predominant technology type for growing crops and indoors. And so that's kind of what folks went to. Then it was only later, it's still, you could argue this, we're not really there yet, but this focus on operating costs became more of a thing. And also as folks became more comfortable with technology too, and they
Yeah.
could say, hey, we can actually produce this crop using a more energy efficient technology that saves us, money on, every month. As long and because we know now what levers, to push and pull to get there.
Yeah.
But it's like if it saves them money, every month, like, okay, that's great, but it's kind of gravy, really.
Yeah.
So it's
I,
performance most, I think, and convenience and upfront cost are kind of things that get it. Which is why the rebate piece, the incentive piece, is huge as a motivator because it reduces that upfront cost. And by the way, helps with the operating costs as well. But
right. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like you've kind of revealed a dirty little secret
Uh-oh. All
about
right.
energy
Yeah.
efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
especially as it comes to lighting. Because I'm looking at the image behind you, and what that image behind you tells me is that that is a at least two-tier cannabis cultivation facility. And we would not be able to do that with high pressure sodium lamps, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So ultimately, that room behind you might actually use more energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Using a more efficient fixture than if we were single level high pressure sodium lamps. So, why would a utility or government incentivize an energy efficient component that would actually result in more energy use?
Mm-hmm. That is the $64,000 question, to date myself a little bit.
And me too.
Yeah, that show was like on like 1982, I think. I don't know. To be
It's
fair, I
probably a
didn't watch it.
million dollar pyramid
I've
now.
only heard about it. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's because they do it. Gosh. Okay. So when they develop a program, the utilities, when they develop an energy efficiency program, they've got these goals to reduce energy use over like a year or 2 years, 3 years. And it's kind of they call deemed savings. And so when a project is on the table for under review, they're like, okay, you know, the efficient version, just to use again the LED lighting example, because that's pretty easy. The LED version, is even over using 2 tiers is going to be using 500,000 kilowatt hours per year, right? Just throw out numbers. If they were going to use not LED but HPS, then yeah, maybe they would be using 300,000 kilowatt hours per year, but they're only getting half the half the productivity come out of that facility. So in absolute terms, yes, it is bad for the utility to have someone using, almost, $200,000, 200,000 more kilowatt hours, per year. But the argument is that, okay, well, if this grower was insistent on getting the output from the LEDs, but using kind of the inefficient technology, then if the space allowed, then they might. Sure, I mean, in theory, you could put in HPS, perhaps, in a two-tier situation. I've never really seen it happen, but the utilities will allow that model to pass in some cases because if it's theoretically possible, who are they to argue that the applicant is not going to do that? So it's kind of crazy. There's definitely some cases where it's hard to imagine in the real world the applicant doing the stupidest, inefficient thing possible. But that's the way these programs work, right? They have to have a baseline that is, that is like it draws a line and saying like, okay, this is the worst thing that someone would do. This is the cheapest thing that they would do, and presuming that this business operator is only interested in kind of the lowest upfront cost. This is what they would choose. But the program, because it exists, is able to, to incentivize the operator to go with a more energy efficient version. And, it's just a function of like how do you determine kind of what the delta is between the baseline and the proposed. And the bigger that number is, the happier the customer is, the happier the utility is in terms of savings.
They
Um,
care about the customer.
it's kind of the customer is secondary. I mean, they want to make sure the customer gets the money that they need to purchase the more efficient equipment, right?
Yeah.
So that's the entire purpose of these programs is to get a customer kind of over the hump, to purchase the more efficient, more expensive equipment because it's like again the idea is that these are more expensive technologies.
Mhm.
So if
I
they
just
weren't, yeah.
I'm just always on the fence about energy
Yeah,
efficiency in general,
right.
or efficiency in general, because to me it just creates a space to fill, right? It's just a
Hmm.
void to fill again.
Yeah.
And if the point of energy efficiency was to reduce, strain on the grid or to increase, our decarbonization or reduce our carbon footprint, it just seems like we're working against each other. We're going to
Mm,
end up using more and demanding more and generating more carbon emissions. So sometimes I don't understand the point
yeah.
of
I,
efficiency programs. And that's just
I,
across the board. I'm not just picking on CEA.
yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think there are always going to be those anecdotes where someone's like gotten away with with a project that actually, again, in theory, makes no sense and should not have passed the utility test. But I think by and large, again, we can look at different examples and kind of and see, how they all kind of, pan out at the end of the day. But I mean, these programs I think have incentivized folks to choose a more energy efficient widget. Um, and if it gets more of those higher quality, if it more efficient widgets into the marketplace and reduces the number of like the dirty, cheap versions, then all things equal, that's a good thing, right? I mean, that reduces in theory the grid demand. I mean, it gets you productivity too. I mean, if that actually enhances productivity, then that's a win-win as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might decrease productivity. I don't know. This is kind of what I think some people in the who grow crops under cover would argue that like, hey, maybe HPS, actually can get more yield, more quality, perhaps, in some cases. And so using LED can reduce the productivity of that fixture of that facility. I know other people argue the opposite thing. I'm not here to try to make the
No,
case
no,
one
no.
way
Yeah, yeah.
or
You
the other. I'm
qualify
not going to
that.
wade
And
in
every
that
grower is
conversation.
different. Every crop is
Yeah,
different. Um,
yeah,
can you give a few examples? I want to stick with lighting for one more question
yeah,
and then I
sure.
want to move on. But I know that there are different ways that utilities incentivize LED lights. And I was
Yeah,
wondering if you could just describe a few of the different ways that if growers are interested in LED lights, I
yeah,
know it's going to depend on their utility, their state, et cetera, but
yeah.
what are some of the two or three different ways that you're seeing across the country methods of incentivizing LED
Yeah.
lights?
Yeah, sure. And this applies to HVAC as well. But again, so just as a caveat before um, people make broad generalizations based on what I'm saying, is that this depends entirely on kind of the specific circumstances of the utility that you're a customer of, right? So devil's in the details, and always kind of make sure you look at the fine print, before you make a decision based on a program that may or may not exist, for you. But so generally speaking, to answer your question, Nadia, there are two types of programs that exist, right? There's what's called prescriptive, and there's the custom. So prescriptive is where the utility kind of offers basically, a table, a sheet of technologies, that like they give a certain dollar amount of, per unit that the customer purchases. And they figure out kind of whatever that dollar amount is based on their own understanding of the savings that the installation of that widget brings the grid. So they use a lot of assumptions in kind of creating that number, and the more data points they have about how that widget performs in the real world, the more likely to have the technology show up on a prescriptive list. So that's kind of the easiest way to do it. I
Just
mean,
to
yeah,
make sure when
yeah,
it's prescriptive like that, is it on a per fixture basis? Like, let's
yeah.
say your fixture costs $100. Like, are they saying, okay, I know you're replacing it with high pressure sodium, or you could have used high pressure sodium instead, and so you're going to save 30% energy. So we're going to give you, I don't know, $30
Hmm.
towards each light fixture that you install.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that kind of the
That's
idea?
right. Yeah, that's the
Okay.
idea. Yeah, exactly. And the reason they do that is to create or reduce as much friction as possible for the customer to make that decision. So
Okay.
the least amount of thought that's required on the part of the customer to say, "Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense." Then the idea is that okay, that will get more of those widgets out into the market and kind of in operation.
Okay.
So it's just a means to simplify, the uptake, of those incentives,
Do
which
they
is,
care anything about the specs on those LED lights, or do you just say it's going to be, do they even have to declare what the manufacturer or supplier is? Do they have to
yeah,
show a a
they'll
PPE value, like what, or does that depend again on maybe location?
yeah, I mean, it generally depends, but as a rule, then yes, you absolutely have to tell them kind of, what equipment you're buying. They may or may not use no make or model, but that's usually kind of one of the data points you need to deliver. So you need to tell them, kind of what you're buying and kind of how many work units, and sometimes they want to see a lighting plan. For prescriptive, they generally don't. It's for the other type, which I haven't gotten to yet, which they need more information. But for the
Okay.
most part, for lighting, they need to be on the Design Lights Consortium qualified products list,
Oh,
the
good.
DLC list. I'm sure you're familiar with, and
Yeah, yeah.
um, not everybody is. It's kind of this wonky organization, the Design Lights Consortium, that exists to basically, assess the quality, of different fixtures. So they have a lighting list for horticultural lighting products. So if it passes that test, then most utilities will allow that
Perfect.
to be installed if that lighting category is on their prescriptive program. So
Okay.
those are the easiest ways to do it. And most people can do that themselves, right? There's very little paperwork involved. Um, and in some cases, it's almost too easy for folks to get these. The kind of a notorious example is Excel Energy in Colorado. You may have heard of this boondoggle that Excel was responsible for, but basically they made it super easy for growers to get incentives for grow lights. So they said for every watt that you're installing of an LED, horticultural LED, we'll give you $1.05, just for every watt that you're installing. So people got the idea, and also there were very little checks in terms of, all right, are you actually going to be installing this equipment? Just it was like,
Are you
it was ridiculous.
serious?
Yeah, it was ridiculous
There's no
how easy it
verification.
was. No, there was not. There was very, very, very little verification because the utility was like, "Hey, wow," because they had their own reasons for doing this, right? And so
Yeah,
they
yeah.
they had
Like we
targets
were saying, their carbon action plans are obliterated.
or
They're like, let's
whatever.
do
Yeah,
something to reduce the energy demand.
yeah, yeah. Excel wanted to do this for whatever reason, and so they put this program together. It was like, okay, yeah, we'll give some money away for this program, but they made it way too easy. So people were installing fixtures that were way too powerful, right? So $1.05 per watt you would get back. So you're like, okay, well, hey, maybe I don't shouldn't be thinking about the lowest energy intensive fixture. I should be going for a 1200 watt LED fixture, if I can get 1200 bucks for it, right? Instead of like 700 bucks per 700 watt fixture. So it really creates and this is kind of what I think maybe your skepticism is
That's part of
is
it.
is is
Yeah.
definitely it's legitimate and it makes sense because yeah, these programs made it way too easy for folks to just get money for equipment that they did not really need to be installing.
Yeah.
And
And
as a
there are
result of
LED vendors, right, in our
yeah,
market that are selling LEDs that use more power than the high
right.
pressure sodium lamps
So
they're supposed to be replacing with less power. I mean,
yeah.
it's sick.
So there you go. But then the argument is like, okay, they're able to produce more, more crop, per watt because they're more efficacious, than a high pressure sodium fixture. So
Yeah,
that's
with
kind of that argument.
enough HVAC and enough water so that they don't
Yeah,
dry out and die.
right, right.
Yeah.
Nutrients and all this stuff. So it's like
Yeah.
more is better. But yeah, there are, I've seen some legitimate academic studies that say that there's at least for cannabis crops, they haven't yet hit the limit in terms of micromoles that a crop will uptake in
Right.
terms of what you get the result that you need. So yeah, the more light you give it, as long as you've got the nutrients and everything else to support that, the more the better. So I think
To
that's
hell
kind
with
of
energy
yeah,
and
exactly.
water
Yeah,
and
but
consumables.
in a vacuum, where all things are equal, it's like, hey. So I think kind of you're seeing some of
Yeah.
that mentality.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a program in Excel that was
Interesting.
prescriptive And the program exploded, way oversubscribed, and then blew their budget for like the rest of the year. And even they're still now at this point trying to recover some of the money they gave you
Wow.
last year. Yeah, it was a
Wow.
total disaster. So that's kind of the worst case scenario for the utility, but best case scenario for a customer, right? Because they're like, wow, this is super easy. I'll check a box. I'll tell them I bought these fixtures, and I'll get, my $100,000 check, in the mail. I was like,
Right.
it's ridiculous. So the custom programs are kind of the way they've always kind of been historically. And this is
Okay.
where it's like the real heavy lifting is involved. This is kind of where we really come in and can provide our value, because in a custom program, you need to basically spell out, watt per watt, and kind of, the difference between the baseline, the inefficient version, and the proposed project. And then you create a story using math and also using words that tell the utility kind of, what the what the benefit of that proposed project is. And, of course, they need to see, data, and kind of maybe you have to back up every single claim that you're making with documentation and with specs and with, runtime and kind of and lighting plans and floor plans and kind of HVAC specifications and watering rates and lighting schedules, all this stuff. And that can get pretty gnarly quickly.
Yeah.
But those custom programs, they provide the best, the highest amount of predictability for the utilities, so they kind of have a much better sense of what they're actually getting with respect to
And
energy savings.
is custom whole building, or can it also be component based?
It can be both. It can be
Okay.
both. It can be component based. I mean, you see fewer custom for just lighting projects because I
Okay.
think there's enough experience out there in the world that utilities have seen how these perform in theory. So they're able to, draw from those experiences and say, okay, well, if these assumptions all hold true, then we expect to see a certain amount of savings. So that's why they can, you tend to see a lot of LED lights on prescriptive programs.
I
But for
am,
yeah.
well, keep going, keep going. I
No, I
just,
was gonna say, but for custom, yeah, where you have more moving pieces, if you're
yeah.
incorporating HVAC into it, if you're incorporating insulated panels, if you're incorporating thermal curtains, then you get a lot more dynamic opportunities in there for the savings to really kind of add up. And so, yeah, that's kind of where you see the most exciting stuff happening.
Yeah. Um, I so a comment and then a question. So we had a grower call us. I don't remember what state it was.
Okay.
And it was in maybe the last year or so.
Mhm.
And they were looking to get LED light incentives to replace their high pressure sodium lamps.
Okay.
And they asked us, it was based off of this custom calculation.
Okay.
And so they wanted their baseline, right? And they wanted us to calculate what the savings would be, because that's how their incentive was calculated, right? What the
Yeah.
maximum annual savings would be from using these LED lights in place of high pressure sodium. And so we're like, oh, yeah, like that's super easy. We can do that. And then
Yeah.
they say, well, but we want you to do the calculation assuming that the lights are on 24/7 all year long. And we're like, we can't do
Okay.
that. We're not doing that. Because that would
Falsify
increase the
data, in other
difference,
words.
right?
Yeah.
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 So we walked away from that project because there was no way ethically we could do that. But just again to the point of, or the idea that these numbers can be manipulated in
Yeah.
order, right, to demonstrate a savings that isn't actually going to be
Mhm.
realized. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of utilities out there, especially with sort of in cannabis, with sort of the, more and more states coming on, and they have less and less experience and resources maybe to understand
Yeah.
where that calculation comes from. And so I'm sure that grower found a sucker to do that for
Mm,
them, or
hmm
they just did it themselves. And I don't know whatever happened with it,
Yeah.
but my hope is that the program director, program person who was
hmm
like, evaluating the application would recognize that no, these growers would never run 24/7 for a cannabis cultivation facility and send it back and say, do
Yeah.
this again with real numbers and your
Yeah.
12/12 or 18
hmm
6 photo periods. But it makes me nervous that
Yeah.
people are, I mean, I don't know why I care that much. I mean, if people are saving some money, but it just, right. I mean, just
Yeah.
your
It's
point
the
of Excel
ethics.
energy, right? Like they
Yeah.
were manipulated, and ultimately stole money in a way from people who did want to do it the right way. Right. And so
hmm
they ran out of budget and they couldn't give incentives and rebates to the growers who legitimately
Yeah.
wanted a better light.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, there's very clear ethics, around this sort of thing, right? I mean, I won't share too many anecdotes about what I've heard people doing out there in the industry, but yeah, I mean, if you're most businesses, if you're incentivized to get as much money as you can, you'll find
You'll
ways to
find a
get it.
way.
Yeah, you'll find ways to get
Yeah.
it. And again, in the Excel example, they created the program rules in a way that made it kind of easy to do that.
Mm,
The program did not require any post installation verification. They didn't require, any real demonstration that there would be savings from this project in terms of the actual operation at that specific site. So yeah, people were able to take advantage of it.
yeah.
It's hard to see, and I've got bills to pay. I've got a family to feed. So it's like someone's willing to offer you money to do something that gets them what they want. It's like it's tempting, like, okay, yeah, I know it's not how you're gonna do it, but I'll help you. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad to say that more often than not, I've said no, to those jobs. But the fact of the matter is that the utility administrators, like the program administrators, when they are also kind of in on the game too, because their job is to, again, find in the utilities. I think to some extent, everyone's kind of knows kind of what the rules are, but yeah, their job is to say, yeah, this project will, we've identified a certain number of savings from this project based on the delta between the baseline and the proposed. And the baseline is kind of imaginary, is the
Thank
thing,
you. That
you
is
know?
exactly the question I wanted to ask you.
Yeah,
Where, for these custom projects,
yeah,
how do you determine what the baseline is? That is one
yeah.
of the hardest metrics in our
hmm
industry to come by.
hmm Yeah, I mean, so for retrofit, it's a simpler operation, more straightforward because you know what's already installed and you know what the historical usage is.
Will you use like monthly utility bills, like for 12 contiguous months to determine what the baseline energy use is for that facility?
They'll look at that. It's like a utility bill is kind of a very rough tool. It's like you don't get much precision just looking at a meter.
But if
A
you're looking
bill
at
here.
whole building kilowatt hour savings, wouldn't that be enough?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, for sure. And it's one of the tools that utility might look at, if they
Okay.
want to get into just to understand kind of, what the baseline energy usage is. But yeah, I mean, for a new construction, the baseline is kind of just getting what's the cheapest way you could build this facility and deliver the kind of the industrial process, right? And that you can create the product, that you want. So what's the cheapest way to do that?
Mm,
And, also kind of what's the most energy inefficient way to do that. So you need those two things working in tandem
okay.
you to get like a project that can deliver the biggest incentive. And yeah, and there is a lot of kind of, I'm not going to say creative math, but it's a puzzle. You kind of have to figure out, okay, working within the terms of that program. How do you get the number to be as juicy as possible? As long as you're kind of in the confines of what kind of an operator would do, that's kind of fair game because the utility at the end of the day, can't really say, hey, applicant, like, you're not going to run it the way that you say you're going to run it, or you wouldn't have run it the way that you said you would have run it, because somehow we can read your mind and we know what you'd have done, in a future state. So a lot of benefit of the doubt goes to the applicant, when establishing that baseline. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the example, I think utilities kind of know that, and some are willing to go with that because it's the function of, like, it's a balance. Like, how much focus, how much energy you're going to put toward, in just getting the incentives out the door, right? I mean, because it's like, do you want to create friction internally, to get the incentives out, or do you want to minimize that? So in California, where you are, there's a ton of friction that utilities kind of put into the process to make sure there's no cheating, or as little cheating as possible. And you guys are notorious for that. Um,
Sorry.
yeah,
You don't
no,
want cheats.
it's good. It's good to be strict, right? And you don't want people to cheat. You don't want people to get away with taking money from ratepayers. But as a result, because of California, because there's so much time and energy spent on, like, scrutinizing every aspect of the application, relatively speaking, very few projects actually get approved.
Interesting.
Um, and at the end of the day, I think that does a disservice as well to those operators that actually want to do some really good stuff, and
Yeah.
and are working hard to be sincere with their intentions. But because the state is so heavy-handed with kind of double guessing what the applicant's doing, then it makes it hard for them to actually get the project done.
I
So
mean, for your baseline, do you always use the same system approach, or do you change it based off of, I don't know, the size of a facility or the location? I'm just thinking, you said,
yeah,
what's the cheapest and most inefficient way? So if I'm thinking,
yeah,
if I have a facility that has, I don't know, four flower rooms and one veg and one clone, right? And then you have all the other ancillary spaces. But do you, like, let's say you took that same exact floor plan, that same exact
mhm.
building plan, and put it in 50 different states. I know it's not legal in 50 different
All
states, but
right,
let's just pretend.
yeah.
Would you use the same assumptions for the equipment that is cheap and inefficient, or do you change it based off of location, for example?
Yeah, no, if you weren't, um, I look at the specific terms and conditions and the rule book for that utility, and I kind of know what it is that they're looking for. So,
Hmm. So the
every
answer is
utility is
no.
really, what's
You
that?
don't you so the answer is no. You don't use the same baseline for every
No,
project.
no. I customize it depending on the kind of, and what the utility is looking at. It's like, what are their criteria for approving projects, and
Can you give an example of like two different?
yeah, let's see. So, an example would be, in terms of, let's say, so a utility will pay out um, an incentive based on project cost, right?
Okay.
It's like a percentage. It's like it's savings. Or so it's going to be the lower of savings, or sorry, it's higher. It's going to be a lower of annual savings, and up to a certain cap of project cost. So, you want to be able to make sure that you're not going over the project cost or under the project cost. So sometimes, you're gonna find ways to kind of hit that sweet spot, however that looks. And it's, again, without making things up, you kind of you shape the application in a way that meets the needs of the project. I'm not gonna go into too many details.
No, I'm just thinking, I
But
mean,
yeah.
project cost is I guess I hadn't thought about project
Yeah.
cost. So that's one reason why you might want something a cheap baseline because the more energy efficient equipment we would expect to be a higher cost, right?
Hmm.
And so the difference between the cheap equipment option and the higher cost option, that gap in the project cost is what is being incentivized, right? Or like whatever that difference is. It's like, okay, well, we're going to pay for 50% of that additional cost that you incur because you're
Yeah.
putting in more efficient equipment. Is that right?
Hmm. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what's another
Yeah.
way that a utility might gauge a custom or a baseline or a custom project?
Yeah, so they'll do it. They look at the annual kilowatt hour savings.
Okay.
It's kind of the biggest thing. And so this is kind of where the the daily runtime really
Yeah,
comes.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So for example, you had mentioned uh the operator that came to was like, hey, let's tell the utility that we're gonna be running this thing 24 hours a day. um and because then you're gonna get like the biggest amount of savings. Like, okay, yeah, sure. Like
Yeah.
our sodium fixture is running all day long, and then we're gonna run our LEDs, for 12 hours a day. So you can really see, how that really, explodes the estimated savings.
Yeah.
Um, but over an annual case, over the course of a year, um, that's kind of where you see kind of the KWH savings kind of number come
So,
together.
so in
And
that
that,
case, you would develop like an energy model to predict energy savings with a baseline and the more
yeah,
efficient equipment. And so
yes.
now it's the difference between how much energy you saved, or
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
So it's like, and again, it's like just if you incorporate, HVAC and dehumidification and all this, then you can imagine how it gets pretty complicated. And this is kind
Yeah.
of where this is where the assumptions matter. Yeah, I'm sure you probably know more than anybody how that can get really complicated. Um,
HVAC especially. It's
yeah.
the hardest to model and to sort of pin down for sure. Yeah.
So the assumptions really matter. But as long as the assumptions are kind of defensible, then you can kind of, it's kind of however you want to, couch it in a way to, to again, it seems like gaming the system is not gaming the system. It's doing what the utility is wanting you
Yeah.
to do, right?
Yeah.
And it's the rules of the road, right?
Mhm.
And 9 times out of 10, um, 99 times out of 100, I should say, I feel really good, about the project that we got over the line. And it's like, hey, this actually is a totally legitimate thing. I mean, and there's no kind of funny business happening, for me at least, for the company, for our work. I put a really high, level of integrity on not cheating the system, right? I did, there are other folks out there who are like, yeah, we just,
Oh, I
don't
know.
really care, about the savings, and we'll just make stuff up, in order to,
Especially if you're and not you necessarily, but
yeah,
especially if that those entities, those companies are getting paid also based
right,
on the incentive that they're giving to the
yeah,
grower,
yeah,
then they're also incentivized to demonstrate greater savings because they're also potentially going to get a greater payback if there's
yeah.
no cap to that. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
And that's a week. So, I mean, I think we're not different in that respect, in the sense that, our fee, if it's not covered by the utility, which in some cases it is, but otherwise, we take a percentage of the incentive check. So we're definitely motivated, to make that as big as possible. Where we draw the line is that, we're not going to just like, make up shit, that clearly is not grounded in reality.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, we can't, you're not going to question necessarily the grower who's saying, "Oh yeah, if I had this technology, I would be running it this in this way." I mean, there are bounds of sort of, just I guess there are standard operating, standard practices in the industry. And if someone's like doing something that's like kind of way outside of that, then obviously that's problematic. But more often than not, they'll actually get flagged by the program
Mhm.
administrator, the reviewer, if they're making assumptions that just make no sense and don't kind of reflect reality. Again, 24-hour a day kind of grow light project, like that's not going to work if you're in a flower situation.
Right.
So that would get flagged
Um,
out.
Yeah, and you don't want to get flagged by a utility because then you'll get more and more scrutinized for your future.
Right. Well, and
Yeah,
that goes to kind of you going back to this whole like this gap of why people weren't taking these projects on again in the cannabis world because folks generally had been not wanting to have any sort of interaction,
that's
with
true.
facility, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
it was your
They were
job.
underground. They were
And
using generators. They were tapping
yeah,
into another energy source. Yeah.
right. In fact, and I heard this. I think this is kind of true, but the advent of solar PV
Mm.
in this country, really, I think, was kicked off to a large extent by growers,
Trying to be off grid.
needing to provide power, for
Yep.
their process, for their lights, and but did not want to, tip off the utility that that they were, growing cannabis indoors. So I think some would say it's kind of, so it's this the advent of solar PV took off at around that same time, coincidentally, in probably in California, in around kind of that era. So yeah, you could think kind of the desire to stay hidden from utilities as kind of the
I,
reason
I
to have
I would
such a
not
robust PV industry.
I would not be surprised if that
Yeah.
was true or partially true. Cannabis seems to be leading technology advancement in a lot of areas. So
Yeah,
honestly, I would
exactly.
not be surprised.
Yeah.
Um, I just want to get your opinion. Once everyone has replaced all their lamps with LEDs, right?
Yeah.
And
It
there are
might
no more
happen.
LEDs to sell because they're going to last for 50,000 hours or something.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think are the next sort of two or three biggest opportunities for growers to increase energy efficiency or reduce energy, however you want to
Hmm.
describe that? And what do you think is maybe untapped currently that um, we should be looking at more as an energy
Yeah,
efficiency measure?
that's a good question. Yeah, I think you're right. That there's going to be a point in time in which kind of the lighting, opportunity is kind of fizzled out. And again, these incentives only exist as long as the utility deems them useful for advancing this technology. So it could be just a matter of, a handful of years before these lighting incentives kind of go away. Because again, they have fulfilled their purpose. So we'll see. So I always tell people like get it while the going is good, because they may not be around, this time next year. And we are kind of seeing some utilities also kind of, pull away from LED lighting incentives for that very reason. There aren't too many, but there are a few out there. But what I think kind of coming down the line, for CEA folks in terms of the incentive piece is, actually, being able to do some whole facility, some whole building modeling. So we're seeing some of that. It's unusual. It's still a little bit rare, I think, because it does require more of a heavy lift on the part of kind of the applicant, and to do that, and then that necessarily kind of adds in time into the process. But if folks are, I think, and utilities are kind of beginning to understand more, how kind of the whole building kind of approach, can really kind of play out. I think that's going to be kind of something we're going to be seeing more and more of. I'd like to see utilities do more on the renewable piece as well, renewable energy. This has kind of been more in the domain of the federal government, to incentivize renewable energies through their tax credits and even some grant programs. So that's kind of maybe again might be going away. It is, to a large extent already. And maybe it'll be picked back up in 4 years. I don't know, Nadia, what your guess
But
is.
my crystal ball says, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so we'll see. But for the meantime, the feds are out of the business, I think, of incentivizing energy efficiency or renewable energy, and also energy efficiency too. They also put some money into that. But I'd like to see, utilities kind of understand the role that renewables can play, and also kind of reducing the amount of power that a customer needs. So in some way cases, it is very much renewable energy or an energy efficient project because it reduces the amount of power that a company needs. So if you can couple renewable energy with maybe some storage stuff as well, some energy storage. Either thermal storage, where you are taking the heat generated either from the sun or from the mechanical process and storing that for a time when it's actually needed. That is also a huge energy savings opportunity, not just for customers, but for the utility as well. So
Yeah.
I think we'll see some more of that as time comes along. Biogas digestion is super cool, and if you're on a more of a closed loop sort of farm, and you have access to actually to compostables, then if you're able to develop a system that can kind of harness the methane gas from the decomposition of the organic material, and kind of you make it a closed loop system, that's super exciting. I'm not seeing a whole lot of that. I think maybe in Sweden you're seeing a bit of that. I'm not sure if you've seen any kind of real closed loop systems that incorporate biogas digestion. CHP exists, but that's natural gas that's piped in, right? Or
Yeah.
um, but biogas would be really cool. I'd like to see some more of that. And the thing is, utilities, they do, they're open to the pilot projects. They'll actually hear you out if you've got something that's
Hmm.
really kind of cutting edge.
Yeah.
So that would be something I would look forward to, is for folks who kind of want to do things out of the box a little bit and have some patience, because it does take some time. But recognize that this innovative approach does require more of an upfront cost. Yeah, in some cases, if you have a utility that kind of is somewhat progressive and is wants to explore these things, yeah, they might play ball with you and be like, okay, yeah, here's some money, install this project, and we'll study it together. And if it
That would be
works,
cool.
then we'll give you more money, right?
Yeah.
But that's kind of where you really need the help of, support of a system of folks to kind of to help make that happen, because it does take time. And kind of we've seen people successfully, take that approach to getting some money for their projects. So people just need to ask questions, I think, is the biggest thing. If there's a project that they want to pursue that is energy savings, but also could cost an arm and a leg, just get in front of the utility, kind of ask, and I mean, okay. If you put the phone and dial the 800 number on the website, you're not going to get the right answer, right? So you have to know who to call. I
Yeah.
know who to call for what it's worth. But that's the kind of thing, I would just, people shouldn't give up if they have a really exciting project that they want to try to pursue. And again, but things change, they change all the time. Like I said, and Con Ed in New York has already kind of ended their lighting, you
Oh,
know,
wow.
program. Yeah, at least for the prescriptive stuff. And indoor horticultural lighting is not on that list anymore. So it's a
Interesting.
much heavier lift to get a lighting project done in Con Ed territory. So that just, you can see more of that. And that changes all the time.
Yeah.
And I
I
do
mean,
publish,
California,
yeah.
they're starting to talk about if LEDs are becoming a standard practice,
Hmm. Yeah, sure.
then should they be providing incentives and rebates anymore?
Right.
That's a real
Yeah.
discussion right
Yeah.
now here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's what happened in for Con Ed in New York, at least they were talking about that. And I think other New York utilities are asking themselves the same thing, which again, I mean, it's a fair question, right?
Yep.
If the market has already accepted these new technologies, then what's the point of the utilities to offer incentives for them?
If that's what you
Um,
were going to do anyway, I think is, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
right, right.
Yeah.
And again, if there's in those areas where it's law to install LEDs, like Massachusetts, right? You've got this the standard now where you're required to do that, at least for the cannabis industry. Yeah, then the utilities, they can't offer any incentives, there
Yeah.
for those applications.
And California is getting to that
Yeah,
point where our energy code, the PPE requirement, is basically forcing growers to pick LED
yeah.
and install LED lights.
Hmm.
There, even now, the next version of the energy code is going to push greenhouses one step closer to mandating LED lights. So
Hmm.
once that happens, then my expectation is that utilities will stop giving rebates for new builds,
Yeah.
but they might still keep them for existing facilities, right? To replace those when your high pressure sodiums reach their end of life,
Hmm.
or you're going to double stack, or you just want more efficiency. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, whatever the regulators decide how they want to write that rule, then yeah, utilities can work with that.
Yeah.
So we'll see, but yeah.
So let me ask you my last official question.
Okay.
And I'm asking all of my guests this question because of the topic.
Uh-huh.
So, you've been in the energy industry for a while, and so I'm curious from your
Hmm.
perspective, how do you define energy?
Hmm. The lifeblood of the universe. I don't know. It
Kind
is
of true.
kind of a good answer, isn't it? It's kind of a BS answer at the same time. But yeah, I mean, it's just so it's what is the definition of energy? I think in the textbook, it's kind of the amount of power required to produce a certain amount of work, I think, or
Yeah, something like that.
something like
Yeah,
that,
that's the
right? Yeah.
very physics
Yeah,
oriented
yeah, yeah,
definition.
exactly.
Yeah.
But no, it's basically the way I think about it is it's gosh, it's one of these questions like, all right, is the sky what is the sky? It's like, all right, well, I
I
think
know,
the
I
sky
know.
is, but
It's like
can I
you
really
have an
explain what the
inherent
sky is?
understanding of it, but then to actually define it is so
Right,
hard.
right. Well, I
Yeah.
think it's so the way I think about it is like, yeah, it's a service, it's product that helps to provide a service
Hmm.
for a process. How's that? Yeah, I don't know. It's this really
I
hard
love
question to
it.
answer on. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it's as good as we're gonna get. I mean,
Yeah, it really is.
that's why
Yeah.
I'm
I'm not
asking everyone because I know everyone is gonna have a different answer. It's gonna
yeah.
be a fun compilation at the end.
It gets things done for us. Energy
It
gets things done,
does. Yeah,
And it's
it does.
everywhere. It's kind of why I made my initial sort of reaction was like the lifeblood of the universe. Because it is everywhere, right? Energy is again, and not to get too woo-woo about it, it's in all of us and it's in everything that we touch and do. But as far as your industrial or commercial process, it's kind of what you need to get the output that you want.
Yeah,
And it gets a resource. It can be wasted. In some cases, you can get more by shining a solar panel on the sky, right? And that's one thing. But if you have to burn a fossil fuel to get to it, then you need to be pretty smart about how much you're going to be using of it.
yeah,
So yeah, it's a precious resource that we need to be kind of mindful of.
it
So
is. And thank goodness for our big energy source in the sky.
right, I know.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's harness that sucker and wind and hydrogen and wave power. I mean, there's so much
yeah.
renewables. I mean, I've been thinking about renewables for as long as I can remember, and it's so exciting to me just the potential that exists out there to harness and use clean renewable energy. I mean, it's still kind of this, you know, it again, if you think about just the potential, it's mind blowing how much kind of energy there is out there that we
It
can
is.
harness. But until then, yeah, we have to, I guess, for better, for worse, work with what we've got, and there's a finite pool of that.
Well, and even to your point of a biogas
Yeah,
digester, right?
right.
I mean, biogas is produced by a plant, right? Which harnessed energy from the sun during that photosynthetic
Hmm.
process,
Yeah,
right? And then we eat it, which gives us calories, and our cows
yeah.
eat it, which give them calories that we then eat, right? And then that
Hmm.
moves us around, and the life cycle goes on. But yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
crazy. Which one of Newton's laws was that energy can't be destroyed or
That's
created?
the first law of
It's the
thermodynamics.
first law of energy. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. The first
yeah,
law of energy, which is true. I mean, it's an infinite loop, right?
yep.
But how we harness it and use it. That's kind of, I guess, what people think about. Like,
And that's what efficiency is, right? Is
Mhm.
like our goal is to get to as close to 100% as possible, right? That the amount of energy you input is as close to the amount of energy that we get out
Yeah.
of that process, which I don't know that we can ever hit 100%, but yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, who knows? 100% efficiency, that would be a beautiful thing,
it would. But
one day
it
we'll
break
be
all
there.
kinds of laws, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah, exactly. But and who knows? I'm not sure if the utilities may be dead and gone by the time we get to that point. Be a different
We
law.
will be, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Um, all right. Well, I have five rapid fire questions for you. So
Okay.
these are unscripted, one sentence, one word. Do feel free to expand on anything if you want,
Okay.
but they're intended to be quick and short and sweet. All right.
Okay.
Are you
Let's
ready?
go. Let's go.
All right. Number one, what energizes you?
Petting my dog, just kind of, doing stuff with nature and getting real with things. So the more I can get out there and kind of just be around living objects, is kind of what gets me going.
I love that. What, in your opinion, is the most underrated opportunity to reduce or save energy in anything?
The most underrated opportunity. The thing I would say for that is just, I don't know, reducing your expectations for what the output needs to be, right? I mean, there's
Ooh.
the bigger is better. I think mentality needs to be
Mm.
questioned, right? So do we need as much as we're producing? Is kind of the biggest thing. So I think that was on a planetary level. Like we're producing so much crap, aren't we, Nadia? Like we just really don't need to be doing this much. Let's slow down. Let's produce what we need and not like a single bit more.
I love that. Well, that
Yeah.
was sort of my next question, which
Yeah.
is how much energy is too much energy?
Yeah, the amount of energy that basically destroys life on Earth, is too much. I mean, again, it's like where does it come from? Is it
Yeah.
dirty energy? Does it come from burning coal? Or does it come from the sun? Or wind? Everything should be treated differently, right? So it's not just like it's not neutral. Energy
Yeah.
is never just, exists in a vacuum. It's like, what is the source code for that?
It's
You know?
it's interesting that you said just, whatever, you said whatever destroys energy. And I like that response because what came to my mind is too much energy is energy that zaps your energy,
Oh yeah.
which as it feels a little counterintuitive, but what I where I immediately go is if like I work too hard,
Yeah.
right? Or I'm traveling too much, that I'm expending a lot of energy doing that. And in the end, it actually reduces my energy, right? On the back
Hmm.
end of that. So it's
Hmm.
interesting that you said destroys energy. And I immediately thought, yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It's no, it makes sense, right? Because you have a finite amount
Yeah.
of your own energy, right? And the more you spend it traveling or running around or doing whatever requires a bit of a heavy lift, then the less you have at the end of the day,
Yeah.
So and then you're just kind of like a puddle on the floor, at around the evening time. So yeah,
Yeah.
you
I
have to be
like that
conscious of it,
answer.
right? It's everywhere. We have energy in our bodies, and like everywhere else. Yeah.
All right. If you could be one type of energy,
Mm.
what type would you be?
I would think I would be wave energy,
Ooh.
because it interacts with the landscape, of the oceans.
Mm,
I'm in Maine. I don't live too far from the ocean. So I'm kind of thinking about the shape of the oceans and the sea and the bays and the fish and the creatures in there and the seaweed and a super dynamic environment. And the fact that through all that you've got kind of the constant motion of the waves. harnessing that and putting that to use. If I could be an electron, that's how I would like to be formed, I suppose. If that's maybe another way of answering it.
I love that.
Like a type of energy, yeah. I guess like the way that I were to be formed, it would be like through wave power.
I love it's very dynamic.
Yeah.
You want to be kinetic energy in the form
There
of
we
a
go.
wave.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's perfect. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Last question, and you
Okay.
have to forgive me because I cannot do a New England accent. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. But I
You
do
could if you
expect
try.
you to respond with a New
I
England
I can
accent.
teach you how to do it if you're interested.
Okay, and we can do that later. We don't want to bore listeners with that, though they'd probably actually really enjoy that.
Uh-huh.
Okay, if you had to only choose one,
Yeah.
okay, lobster, bia, or chowder?
Yeah. Oh, to be, you mean, or to
Uh,
consume?
no, no, to consume.
Okay.
No, we're not
Um,
referencing the movie The Lobster, but that is a
yeah.
dark movie.
I'd say chowder for sure, right? Because
Yeah?
I've some horror stories of eating too much lobster, mostly with like really old butter that I
Oh,
shouldn't have consumed. So
that
anyway, that's like
sucks.
I don't want to have that memory. Um, Beer is great, but you only can have so much of that, right? Before things get ugly. But chowder, you can have all sorts of different types of stuff in it. You can have, well, you specify, right? So you have corn chowder, you can have clam chowder, you can have fish chowder, you can have all
You
sorts
could
of
have
different
lobster chowder.
lobster chowder, absolutely. And so I'm definitely, yeah, I would say that because again, I get more options that way,
Yeah,
and
yeah, there you go. You could
you got
just
different.
splash a little beer in there, even if you want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But yeah. But yeah, come over. I can teach you a New England accent anytime. But actually, I'm from Kansas City originally, so
Okay.
my New England accent is pretty rough. But my
Okay.
kids can pull it off more authentically than I can.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for the
Yeah,
conversation today. I really hope that our listeners find this useful and interesting. Just to wrap things up, how can our listeners contact you if they
yeah,
want to learn more about what rebates and our incentives are
yeah,
available where they are,
yeah.
or, getting some guidance in that application process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, lots of different ways. Maybe the easiest is my email address, sam@climateresourcesgroup.com. Um, I talk about this on my website, which is climateresourcesgroup.com. And then Enlighten Your Grow is sort of like the indoor grow kind of program under that. So folks can also go to enlightenyourgrow.com.
Awesome.
But I'm also on LinkedIn a bunch, too much maybe sometimes. So people can just kind of look up Sam Milton and track me down on that. So yeah, I look forward
Awesome.
to folks can reach out to me any questions. I'm happy to always do a quick, like response, like, hey, what's happening in my utility? What's this project worth? So I talk to developers all the time and customers and vendors. So yeah, I love this stuff. So the more the merrier. So please.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Sam, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Lonnie. Appreciate having me.
Thanks.